This is my presentation for LAWS467 International Human Rights Law. The topic today is the international human right to abortion. Abortion is a very contentious topic worldwide, and there are many different opinions about the procedure that are often based in very contrasting areas and ideas such as religious, ethical, scientific, or medical thought. And these all create quite a whirlpool of debate and two strong opposing sides. Human rights as an area sort of intercepts this topic of abortion most often when a state employs restrictions, bans, or criminalizations on abortions or access to abortions. This in turn is what affects the individual's rights. The rights of bodily autonomy, right to life, and freedom from discrimination are three rights that have perhaps the most strongest links to abortion, or the clearest links to abortion. However, there are also debates and arguments around whether or not the right to an abortion itself is, or perhaps should be, a valid human right protected and enshrined in international law, along with the rest of them. So what actually is abortion? Simply put, abortion is the medical process of terminating a pregnancy. Now, the context of an abortion varies quite vastly, as there are a multitude of reasons one could want to terminate a pregnancy or perhaps need to terminate a pregnancy. These can range from the health and well-being of the mother, for example, in something like an ectopic pregnancy where the egg implants and grows outside of the uterus, causing severe and potentially life-threatening complications. The health and well-being of the unborn child or fetus, for example, things like fetal abnormalities or hereditary diseases that are discovered after fertilization during pregnancy that perhaps weren't known about before. And perhaps most commonly in cases of unwanted or accidental or perhaps forced pregnancy, and these include rape. It is extremely important to note here that non-medical abortions do exist, or self-employed methods for terminating a pregnancy. These are, of course, extremely dangerous, and it is assumed that where one has no access to a safe medical procedure for an abortion, that self-aborting the pregnancy is simply not an option, as the risks are just too high and it's far, far more dangerous. So where and how exactly do human rights intersect with this topic of abortion? The first right in question here is the right to bodily autonomy. Although not often explicitly drafted or worded into these human rights instruments, it is strongly implied in most of them. And there is a certain amount of overlap here with bodily autonomy and reproductive rights or sexual health rights. Pregnancy itself is a very physiologically demanding process. The body undergoes drastic changes and also presents strong mental challenges to the mother. Where a pregnancy is forced because of restricted access to an abortion, the mother therefore then has no choice but to carry the baby to term, or at least as far as it can go. Therefore, these physical changes that occur to the body during pregnancy are not directly her choice and were in a way forced upon her, and that is what infringes upon this right to bodily autonomy. The second right here is the right to life. It's not uncommon for some pregnancies to cause very, very severe risks or complications. Pregnancy itself is not without risks, but there are some that pose very higher risk and a higher risk of fatality and more severity and potentially life-threatening complications. So examples could be something like that ectopic pregnancy that I mentioned, or other risks that can occur, for example, placental complications, or a variety of conditions such as preeclampsia, which is the sudden high blood pressure of the mother, which in turn causes more complications down the line. And these could be as severe as seizures, for example. Now, it is arguably more common to see complications like this during the birth itself, so during the act of childbirth. For example, a breached baby is very common, easily rectified, but is not without its risks. Severe hemorrhaging, complications from emergency surgery, such as a C-section. And of course, while medical professionals are equipped to deal with and mitigate these risks, they are still risks, and most of them can be fatal to the mother and varying degrees of severity, but a lot of them are life-threatening. So that's where this right to life comes into play, and when that mother was denied access to an abortion and forced to assume all these risks that come with pregnancy, should the mother die during childbirth or at some point during the pregnancy, that right to life is potentially infringed because it was a forced assumption of the risks. That's where that right comes into effect. The third right here is freedom from discrimination. The Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, otherwise known as CEDAW, is widely considered quite a global international bill of rights specifically for women, and it encompasses many rights, not just reproductive or bodily autonomy. However, for this purpose, we are focusing on these reproductive and sexual health rights. CEDAW impacts these rights by obligating signatory states to guarantee women's rights to health, rights to non-discrimination and autonomy in making decisions about their reproductive lives. That's where that overlap occurs between bodily autonomy and reproductive health and the rights to both. It is therefore very, very arguable that restrictions on abortions would in turn sort of infringe these rights, and the state responsible for the restrictions would then be in breach of their CEDAW obligations. Of course, that does require that the state both signed CEDAW and has ratified it, and that's where it gets a little bit more complicated in the real world. So for a real life example, a real life case, the very public and well-known Roe v. Wade case. So the USA is one such state who originally signed CEDAW, but quite importantly, they have not yet ratified the treaty. Now, the overturning of Roe v. Wade in 2022 created a slew of so-called trigger bans on abortion coming into effect in many US states. This map here is obviously of the USA and is color-coded by abortion laws or abortion restrictions by state. So the blue states here have protected abortion laws or rights, often enshrined in the state's constitution, while the maroon states employ a total ban on abortion. Those are the two ends of the spectrum there. There are a total of 12 states in the maroon. These red states employ varying bans that are based on gestational period, which is far more common, especially internationally, and these yellow states do remain with legal abortions, but that is conditional on amendments to the state constitution, in the sense that should these states want to amend their constitution to illegalize or criminalize abortion, they could. And it shows that these red and yellow states are likely actually moving towards that maroon side of the spectrum, that total ban. The ban based on gestational period sounds bad, but it's not quite as malicious as it sounds, and it is quite common. For example, here in New Zealand, an abortion is legal up to 20 weeks, which is about 4.5 months. But after that 20-week mark, there needs to be other factors, such as the health risks that I mentioned, in order for an abortion to be legally done. So if there aren't those additional risks or complications, it's not legal. And of course there are other checks and balances. There are second consultations and additional opinions that need to happen as well. But bringing it back to the USA, some states, for example, such as Iowa, have only a 6-week ban. It's still a varying ban based on gestational period, but it is quite a short one. So past 6 weeks in OI, you can't receive an abortion. And that is potentially problematic because a lot of the time mothers don't even realize or find out that they're pregnant until about, could be 4 weeks. And then that's giving them, 1 week, 2 weeks to make a very large decision, and then it's illegal. This question of the human right to abortion. As I mentioned, there are a lot of arguments and research that say this right should be valid and protected as itself. But of course, there are the other arguments and the other side of the argument that says it definitely is not a right and shouldn't be. And it actually seems that there's more material or research for the other side of the argument saying that it shouldn't be a right. But that doesn't mean it's impossible to envision what this right potentially could or should look like. So words such as legal, safe, unrestricted, the right to a legal, safe and unrestricted abortion, or access to an abortion by a licensed medical practitioner. These are all words that are quite exclusionary in the sense that it excludes an illegal, an unsafe or restricted abortion. The unrestricted word is potentially a little bit contentious. However, legal and safe, that's simply exclusionary of home abortions, backdoor abortions, unlicensed abortions, or unsafe abortions. And including something like by a licensed medical practitioner also further excludes these potentially unlicensed medical practitioners or just non-medical practitioners at all. This is a potentially quite narrow wording. You could broaden it a little bit. You could, for example, use something looser like the right to reproductive health care, or the right to reproductive health care procedures around pregnancy or terminating pregnancy. But then the more you broaden the scope, the more things will be included, and then that's an issue for drafting and debate, and would take probably quite a long time. As I mentioned, the other side of this coin, the argument that abortion is definitely not a human right, and it definitely shouldn't be. This is very, very clear and very prevalent in the anti-abortion movement, which is often backed by the pro-life ideology. Now, these opinionists, more often than not, also happen to be conservative, far-right Christians, especially in the USA, which is perhaps an unlikely coincidence. So, like Grace Melton here and her article in The Heritage, which is again a far-right conservative think tank / newspaper based in Washington, D.C., they tend to argue that abortion is absolutely, definitively not a human right in itself, and it's backed by this idea that the right to life outweighs it even if it was a possibility. And that is quite a strong argument, and the sense that the right to life is potentially the most important right that humans have. It does go further to argue that this right to life of the unborn child also then outweighs any of these other human rights questions or that we explored before. So the right to bodily autonomy, the right to freedom from discrimination, because the right to life is so sacred, and again, the idea that life begins at conception means that this right to life of the unborn child is there from day one. Now, that is in turn another issue, that idea that life begins at conception as opposed to childbirth or other gestational periods such as brain development or heartbeat is really the ground basis for this argument. This is not a scientific presentation, so I'm not going into detail on why this life begins at conception is both scientifically and perhaps philosophically incorrect, at least in my opinion. However, I will note that I am sitting here with things such as a beating heart, neurons firing in my brain, thoughts, consciousness, at least a certain level of human intelligence, which all point towards this presence of life, which is, again, the basis of the right to life. as opposed to the fusing of two cells at conception. So as we saw, human rights really comes into play with abortion when there are restrictions and when there are bans and when it's criminalized. Abortion itself as a procedure is not really infringing human rights, or that's one argument. That argument against abortion is more moral and ethical. And when you have these restrictions, that in turn, forces these assumptions of risks that I talked about, and it forces the mother to undergo these physiological changes that perhaps weren't her choice. And it's that false assumption of risk that then infringes. It's not the abortion itself. The freedom from discrimination, restrictions on abortions are inherently targeted in the sense that not everyone is capable of pregnancy. And those who aren't capable of pregnancy, they're not directly affected by these restrictions on abortions. They could easily be indirectly affected. For example, if someone's partner was pregnant, and then it may affect them emotionally or financially, that sort of thing. However, it is a targeted restriction, and therefore the infringements are targeted, and that in itself begins to become discriminatory. That marks the end of this presentation, and I thank you very much for all your attention.